The E3 2021 announcement of Metroid Dread sent me back down a winding path through the Metroid series, specifically the 2D mainline entries, the last of which being 2002's Metroid Fusion for the Game Boy Advance. I thought it would be fun and interesting to revisit these games and take them on their own merits in their original incarnations. So what that means for this video and the subsequent ones that will follow is that I won't be talking about remakes, official or otherwise, until far later down the line. As much as I am excited to go back to Metroid Zero Mission or give Samus Returns a proper run through, for now, we're just gonna concentrate on the one game. So let's take a trip to planet Zebes and talk about Metroid. The short version is this. Metroid, an action-adventure game, was released by Nintendo for the Famicom Disk System in Japan in 1986, and would make its way to the Nintendo Entertainment System elsewhere in 1987 and beyond. It was a massive critical and commercial hit loved by all, right? Well, not really. The Metroid series has never been known for its commercial success, and while its critical standing is largely unquestioned, times were a little different in 1986. Video games were neither as complex nor as defined as they would come to be just a few years later. Metroid is an early pioneer of what would become, you guessed it, the Metroidvania genre, a category of non-linear exploratory action games that often focus on light role-playing game elements as well as item-locked forward progression. Developed as a joint operation between Intelligent Systems and Nintendo's oldest development studio R&D1, Metroid was an early example of a Nintendo game that wasn't designed around the arcade, though it would make its way into some PlayChoice 10 cabinets as well. It was directed by Satoru Okada and Masao Yamamoto, scored by Hirokazu Tanaka, and produced by Nintendo engineering wizard Gunpei Yokoi. The overall scenario was created by Makoto Kano, and the characters were designed by Hiroji Kiyotake. Also involved in the game's development was Yoshio Sakamoto, who would in subsequent entries take a more direct role as director and overall herald of the Metroid series. While the Famicom Disk System version of the game would employ a battery saving system similar to games like The Legend of Zelda, that feature wasn't yet ready to make its way to the West. Instead, Metroid's NES variant uses a system of long, cumbersome passwords to save the myriad of information it needs to retain about your game progress. I do wonder how the legacy of the game would change had Nintendo waited just a little longer to release it in the West and include the battery saving system, but we're not here to talk about that today. So, okay. Now that we've got some of the rote boring stuff out of the way, let's actually talk about this game. Metroid is about Samus Aran, a space bounty hunter wearing a technologically advanced biomechanical suit in the year 20X5, tasked with penetrating the space pirate base on the planet Zebes. Zebes? Zebes? Zebes. Zebes. The planet's name is Zebes. Anyway, the space pirates attacked a Galactic Federation research station and stole samples of the titular Metroid, an energy harvesting creature from the planet SR-388. Samus alone has to fight through the space pirate defenses and destroy the space pirate mother brain that controls the operation deep within an area of the planet called Turian. You still with me? Awesome. Also on the planet Zebes, Samus will find Space Pirate Commander Ridley as well as Space Pirate ally Kraid, who each have their own layers in the planet's cave system that will need to be explored and pilfered for new items and gear. Speaking of gear, when you touch down in Brinstar, the opening area of the game, you're not even at full energy. No matter how far in the game you are, when you restart after dying or from entering a password, you always restart with 30 energy, even if you have multiple energy tanks at your disposal. It's kind of frustrating. Really one of my big knocks about the game, but given the state of battery backups and game design in 1986, I get it. Once you've got some powered up gear, getting where you need to go doesn't take that long. I mean, The Legend of Zelda does something similar, so it's not as bad as it sounds. Across the game's 5 areas, you're going to do a fair bit of backtracking. Thankfully, the actual map isn't all that large, but it is somewhat repetitive and it can be easy to get yourself lost. That in mind, each zone at least has its own defined look and is separated by elevators to travel between them. Something I do like about this game is how even at its very basic level, Metroid is pretty open-ended for a game from 1986. Several of the power-ups you don't even need to collect, and by clever use of items like the Ice Beam, you can actually circumvent what the game intends for you to do. Plus, While this isn't exactly a built-in gameplay mechanic, you can do some basic manipulation with the enemies to make the game easier to deal with. Due to hardware and memory limitations, there can only be so many sprites on screen at once. Having a lot of creatures on screen is a great way to tank the frame rate, and if you freeze some of the respawning varieties, it prevents more of them from popping up in their place, which can make certain areas much less of a pain in the ass. While it predates what would become known as 0451 games, that little bit of control, intended or not, does provide the slightest hint of that sort of immersion in the future, where if you can think of something, you just might be able to do it. Now, back to items, because Metroid is full of them. You even find one seconds after beginning the game, just waiting for you there on a pedestal. The Marumari, or Morph Ball as it would be known going forward, provides Samus with a way to roll through small passageways, seeing as crouching isn't even a thing in this game. It's one of the most useful tools you'll find. You're really not going to get that far without it. In fact, you can't. If you go far enough to the right, you'll find you can't pass through a narrow passageway without it. The Morph Ball is pretty essential. Other things you can collect include the Varius suit, which provides much greater levels of defense against the creatures of the planet Zebes, as well as the Screw Attack, which turns your somersault spin into a killer bolt of energy that allows you to cut right through a lot of what gets in your way. Both of which would become series mainstays going forward, and once you have them, you're really a force to be reckoned with. Samus starts the game with a basic energy blast attack that won't even travel the full length of the screen, so you're gonna need to track down the long beam, and once you find it, it is often the first of the game's items you discover that are provided to you via the stone Chozo statues, representing the benevolent race of bird people who designed Samus's power suit, of which you'll find several littered across the planet Zebes. The long beam will stay with you throughout the game, while the wave and ice beams would stack on top of it. With that in mind, you can't have both the wave and ice beam at the same time, so you've got to make a choice. The wave beam is more powerful, but the ice beam provides a level of strategy. Neither is a bad option, but the ice beam definitely makes Turian a bit easier to traverse given that you can freeze the titular Metroids there. Of course, there's not just Metroids. Zebes is full of little creatures roaming and flying around that fit one way or another into the classic Nintendo mainstays such as birds, bugs, crabs, turtles, whatever the hell these things are, and fire dragons. All of the staples are here. In fact, despite infiltrating a space pirate base, there really aren't any space pirates to be found outside of the mini-bosses Kraid and Ridley, and the Mother Brain in the jar. Now, let's talk about that for a second. The final boss of this game is a brain in a jar that you just fire missiles into while dodging the little rings and shots coming at you, and try not to die or get knocked into the lava. It's not that easy. It can actually be kind of a pain. But I really appreciate how the final boss isn't this huge encounter. You're essentially just pulling the plug and blowing up this weird brain that's controlling the whole operation. Once it dies, however, the path behind it clears with a message stating that a bomb is about to go off and you need to get out fast. So you proceed out the left side of the room and start climbing up a tall corridor by way of tiny platforms while the clock ticks down. Sure, it's simplistic by today's standards, but I think in 1986 this amounts to a full-on set-piece moment, given that this is the only time in the game you ever travel through this area. Finally making your way to the top, you hit the elevator, and that's it. That's the end of Metroid. Samus has saved the galaxy, for now at least. And then, if your completion time was quick enough, the grand reveal. You have been playing as a woman this entire time. Samus Aran is a woman. I've always thought this was super cool, but in hindsight, it's wild how far they try to go to hide it. Every mention of Samus in the instruction manual refers to her as male. The back of the NES box doesn't even really mention her, only referring to the player character as you, but you, the player, have been playing as a kick-ass woman the whole time. And this was by design. Samus's character designer, Hiroji Kiyotake, based her design on Kim Basinger, along with Sigourney Weaver as Ellen Ripley in the Alien films. The game was actually released for the Famicom Disk System a few weeks before James Cameron's Alien sequel, Aliens, hit Japan at the end of August 1986. Whether this was intentional or not, I feel like it was a pretty smart business move, since Metroid went on to sell 2.73 million copies, and it is still one of the highest selling entries in the series. Metroid has multiple endings, and depending on how quickly you finish the game will determine which ending you will see. 10 hours of gameplay will net you the worst ending, where Samus won't even face you. 5 hours yields you the bad ending. 3 to 5 hours yields you the fair ending, where Samus's helmet is off. 3 hours or below results in the good ending, where Samus is down to a leotard. And for the maniacs beating the game in under an hour, Samus is down to a swimsuit because people were horny, I guess. Anyway, getting the good ending and pressing start sends you back to the start of the game in Brinstar, albeit with a new look. You'll start with whatever gear you ended the game with, only now Samus is sporting the leotard, and you're gonna have to track down your energy tanks and missiles again. Of course, you also start with only 30 health, but starting with all of your previous gear and the ability to get an energy tank almost immediately, this is really a non-issue. I know I keep saying this, but I really like this game. I think it really pushes the limits of what the Nintendo hardware could do in 1986, even though games would continue pushing it for years to come. I still think it's pretty ambitious despite some design choices I'm going to just attribute to inexperience. Super Mario Bros. Forces you to move onward to the right through levels in a linear progression, while The Legend of Zelda allows you to go in 4 directions across a larger map and seek adventure, diverting from the overworld map into one of the game's many dungeons. Metroid is a big map divided into several interconnected zones, and you just have to find your way out of it. However, some items you really need are kind of off of the beaten path. Sometimes the fact that there's a secret in the room isn't very well telegraphed. The specific musical piece that plays in certain rooms lets you know you're probably about to find something interesting nearby. With that, plus the Morph Ball and the Morph Ball bombs, everything else is just to aid your survival. Metroid is moderately difficult, but once you collect a little bit of gear, you're afforded a lot more room for error, and it ups your survivability considerably. By the time you've collected the Varia suit, Screw Attack, and a couple of energy tanks, you're likely to be much more competent at the game anyway, which also helps your odds. I would say the only really dangerous areas in the game are the mini-boss chambers, as well as the corridor that leads you to Mother Brain with its screen full of projectiles to sort out. Metroid really is a pretty cool game, especially for 1986, and I think it's totally worth your time to play it. Play it with a FAQ or even some maps if you need to. Metroid isn't going to do it for you, and the sameness of many of the areas hinder the chance of certain screens acting as navigation landmarks. It's fun to just get lost, but even while collecting footage for this video, I was playing with maps in front of me just to keep myself moving at a reasonable pace and not waste a ton of time. I'm not an expert at this game by any means, and I can knock it out somewhere between 2 to 3 hours if I have maps in front of me. I don't even have a predetermined route or anything of that sort, but thanks to glitching and speedrunning tactics that have developed over years since release, the game can be beaten in less than 20 minutes if you feel so inclined. While something I greatly admire, speedrunning is not something I feel very equipped to talk about, especially with this game. But if you're interested, it is a lot of fun to watch a seasoned pro just straight up destroy this game in a matter of minutes. The addition of multiple endings helped to facilitate this, and it made Metroid an early candidate for the speedrunning community to sink their teeth into. Metroid certainly isn't the most complicated game, and I'd arguably consider it somewhat primal in its design, but it is incredibly influential. From the non-linear Castlevania games to Dark Souls and beyond, I'm willing to say Metroid is just as influential as Mario or Zelda, even if Nintendo doesn't do a great job of acknowledging it sometimes. And I think the NES game stands well on its own. I guess Nintendo did for a while too, since it would take them 5 years before releasing a sequel, which we'll talk about next time on this Metroid Retrospective. Metrospective? Yeah, let's go with that. Metrospective. See you next time. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. This took a little longer to put together than I had planned, but life and health related issues kinda got in the way, as well as the reality that I'm kind of figuring this out as I go. Now that I have a little better idea of what I'm doing, future videos likely won't take as long, and I have the next couple big ones on something of a timetable to try and get them out in a more timely fashion. So with that, thanks again. See you next mission.